Okay, this is part two of our review of Unit 1, and hopefully it will help you to answer the third question, the long question on your unit test. And that is, how do we get to uh, really happy colonials that consider themselves to be British to all of a sudden deciding they need to declare their independence from England? In order to do that, I'm going to share my screen with you. And we're going to go to the week 3 course materials, and then we're going to scroll down. What's going to be most helpful for you is chapter 6 and the PowerPoint for chapter 6 to help you answer that question. So how does the 7-Year War fit into all of this? That's the basic question. As I said, the Americans, the colonials, were quite happy to be British. The British were the most powerful country in the world. You know, they were proud to be British. They followed British rule. They had British holidays. Basically speaking, they were quite content to be British. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why they were so content is because the British practiced what was referred to as salutary neglect. Salutary neglect means that basically the English let these colonies do whatever they pleased. The colonies had been independent of Britain, basically speaking. They had their own governments. Each colony had their own government. They did their own economic transactions, etc. As long as the colonies were part of what was called the mercantile system, the British would basically say, okay, that's fine, just send us all of your goods and we'll be happy. So the British are being benefited by the colonies in a couple of different ways, particularly because of the forests that we talked about in the last video. The colonies had lots of wood to make lots of ships, and British ships were made by colonials, in particular in New England. They also received, as we know, cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, things like that from the south, and fish from the Cape Cod area, as we already talked about. So that was the contribution, the colonial contribution to the English mercantile system. So again, everybody's pretty happy. The British are leaving us alone. We're doing our own thing. Life in the colonies had gotten to be really good. We're talking about some of the best living conditions in the world by the 1700s. As we've already talked about, the age expectancy or mortality rate is like 60, 70 years old, which is way higher than most European countries at the time. So life is good in the colonies. They're happy. Everything is going well. So why all of a sudden by the mid 1700s was there discontent in the colonies? And it all starts with the 7-Year War, or what we called the French and Indian War here in the colonies. Basically, if we know anything about world history, we know that the British and the French were constantly fighting with one another throughout its entire history. So this was just another one of those wars between the two of them. Only this time, it becomes more of a world war in the sense that the colonies got involved as well. So the British colonies basically were battlegrounds against the French colonies. Using North America as an example, we have the 13 original colonies that were English. And then up in Canada, we have the French. So because of this 7-year war, the colonies here, 13, original colonies here, end up getting involved in this war as well. The war initially isn't great for the British, but eventually things will start to work out fairly well for them. Here in the colonies, the British were not doing well against the French Canadians, but eventually that would turn around. So what would happen is the British would send troops to the colonies to protect the colonies from French invasion. And so because it's a war, they're sending more and more troops into the colonies. The colonies were expected to do a couple of different things. First of all, they were expected to fight whenever the British soldiers come along and said, hey, grab your guns, let's go fight. They were expected to do that. They were also expected to feed and clothe the soldiers, and provide them with living areas. So that basically was the role of the colonials. Now, here's the problem. The colonials are not soldiers. You need to understand that in the 1700s and prior to that, armies were made up of professional soldiers. These are guys that spent their entire life preparing themselves to be the best soldier that they could possibly be. They would train constantly in the art of war. And so what war looked like in the 1700s is you had one massive army that were called the British meeting on the field of battle with a massive army that were called the French. They would fight it out, and whoever was still standing at the end won the battle. So that was basically how war was fought in the 1700s. The problem for the colonials was that they were not professional soldiers. They were farmers or fishermen or whatever they were. And so when they were called up by the British to fight the French, yeah, they did. They went home and they grabbed their muskets off of the fireplace mantle and they went off and marched off to war along with the British soldiers. The problem is that they are not prepared to be soldiers. That's not their occupation. And so the fighting that they tended to do was not traditional kinds of warfare. They were used to fighting Indians, for example, and the Indians, as we've seen in movies and things, I mean, they'd be hiding in the forests, and you would hide behind trees and rocks and things like that, and you'd shoot at one another, or you would have a lot of hand-to-hand combat, and that's what the colonials were accustomed to, a kind of guerrilla warfare more than professional armies. So they did their part to some degree. It wasn't again, professional kind of warfare kinds of things that they were doing. So they did do that. They would help the soldiers, the British soldiers, to some degree, if the French were in their neighborhood. So basically, the colonials had militias. These were, every Saturday morning we met at the center of town, and we picked a guy that would lead our little cohort, and we'd march around and practice shooting and things like that. But basically speaking, it was simply a volunteer organization. Everybody kind of joined in defense of the community. So when the French were in the vicinity of their community, they would call up their militia and they would go fight the French. So they did that part. They did, in fact, provide food and clothing and things like that to the British Army. Um, and obviously, armies need a lot of food to march on. They did house particularly the officers of the British Army. And so they did their job. And they were quite proud of the fact that they helped in the war effort. And when the war comes to an end, um, in that Treaty of Paris in 1763, basically speaking, the English, I'm sorry, the colonists here in North America were quite happy for the British. Obviously, we fought the French and we won. One of the big advantages of that, let me go to this. Let me go to this map. One of the big advantages is that now this is what the British Empire looks like after 1763. You see the yellow part. Initially, if you see the red line, that red line initially, that was the 13 original colonies. All of the yellow area west of that red line west and north belong to France. So Canada and the areas like Ohio, Indiana, all that, all the way to the Mississippi River belong to the French. Well, as a result of the French and Indian War, the English possessions, territory, extended to the Mississippi River. And then west of the Mississippi River, as you could see, the darker mustard color, that all belongs to the Spanish at this time. So this is really important for the colonials because we had been growing at such a rapid pace that we were getting very crowded staying east of the Appalachian mountain chain, which is basically that red line. And so one of the reasons why the colonials wanted the British to win against the French is so that they can, in fact, cross over the Appalachian Mountains and start to get into that beautiful, fertile land in the Ohio River Valley, etc. So they were happy. Yeah, let's do it. I mean, we're going to help win. And when it's all over, they're very happy about what they did. Unfortunately, the British were not real happy about about the contributions of the colonials. As I said, the English fought in a traditional form. The colonials were more guerrilla warfare kind of people. The generals would complain, these people are just worthless. We send them out to defend a line, and the French break through the line and let us whatever. And so the British military is very disgusted about colonial fighting process, and that was part of it. So what about this supplying the army thing? Well, yeah, they didn't supply the army, but they were pretty tight-fisted about it all. They didn't really, the British had to struggle to get the things that they needed. And not only that, but they were charging the British for those foodstuffs and that cloth and whatever they needed. So in other words, there were some colonials that were making some pretty good money off of the British as a result of this French and Indian War. And so we begin to see this friction between the colonials and the British. The things that the British thought that colonials should do because they are British citizens, they didn't feel that they did. The people who in the colonies believed that they did exactly what they were supposed to do. And so there starts that friction. Now, here's the problem with that expanse. Let me go back to this map again. Again, we have the Appalachian mountain chain. That's the red line here. And people began the process of crossing over the Appalachian Mountains and into this very rich area here around the Ohio River Valley. Here's the problem. It was called the French and Indian War because the Indians joined the French for the most part. There were very few Indian tribes that joined the British. And the reason why is because the Indian, how the Indians got along with the French was much better than how they got along with the English. The French pretty much left them alone, let them do their own thing. They didn't try to civilize them or do all this sort of stuff. They just let them roam around. The English kept pushing them farther and farther west and killed off many of their people. And so when the war broke out, the Indians joined the French. When the war ended and the treaty was signed, that didn't necessarily mean that everybody was going to be happy with that treaty. And that, in particular, the Indians in what we call the Northwest Territory, which is now places like what is now Detroit, for example. There was an Indian chief by the name of Pontiac, and Pontiac is going to try to get his land back, and so he leads this rebellion in 1763. The British were able to put down the rebellion, but what it does is it shows the British, this is, we're talking about some huge expanse of land that needed to be protected. How many troops are we going to need to do that? How much money will we spend in order to do that? And so the British start to think about what they're going to do with this new circumstance that they're in. And they passed what is called the Proclamation of 1763. This Proclamation of 1763 is very, very important. Basically, it says that you colonists cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. And their rationale was, we can't protect you from the natives. Well, this really aggravated the colonists because that was a big part of them fighting this war in the first place. We want to move west and start expanding. We're expanding at a very rapid pace. We need more land. But the British passed the Proclamation of 1763, basically says, nope, sorry, you can't go across the Appalachian Mountains. And that's going to further frustrate the colonies. Secondly, again, as part of the conversation about how in the heck are we going to protect the colonies, they also started to say, well, I don't understand, why is it that we are protecting the colonies? Why is it that we are flipping the bill for protecting the colonies? And so the British began to pass a number of laws to tax the colonies, supposedly to help defer the cost of their defense. And you need to understand that this 7-year war cost Britain, they won the war, but boy, it cost them tons and tons of money. So now they have to try to fill up the treasury again. And one of the ways they're going to do that is they're going to tax the colonies. The first direct tax on the colonies was the Molasses Act. Excuse me, the Molasses Act of 1733. It was an act that we were supposed to pay tax on molasses, which is a derivative of sugar. But nobody paid attention to it. The colonies didn't pay attention to it. The British didn't really have land offices to collect the taxes and stuff like that. There was all kinds of underground shipping, that was bringing in sugar and molasses without going through the ports and things like that. So nobody really enforced it. Nobody really paid much attention to it. Now, I use the example of direct taxing. That's an important aspect of this because what the colonists are going to be offended by is this idea of a direct tax on me as a person. I have to buy sugar and I have to go to the store and I buy the sugar and then I have to throw the tax on top of that. That's now we're talking about the British getting into my personal life. And the colonists did not appreciate that at all. After the 7-Year War, French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it, the Lord of the Treasury, a guy by the name of Grenville, put out their 4 policies: the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, and the Stamp Act. Again, this is going to really aggravate the colonists. These are direct taxes against them. And I would suggest that stuff like the Stamp Act really affects the aristocratic people of the colonies, the lawyers, the doctors, the movers and shakers of the colonies, because the Stamp Act simply says you have to put a stamp on documents and things like that. Well, the average farmer, has a pig farm out in Western New York, doesn't have any need for documents and things of that nature. I want you to kind of tuck that into your head for further thought. So now people are starting to see this as a imposition. They're saying, hey, look, you guys practiced this salutary neglect. You left us alone. You let us do whatever we wanted to do. Now all of a sudden you're trying to get involved. Now, and not only that, but think about this. There is a huge number of soldiers that are now part of their world. I mean, everywhere they went, in the town of Boston, they're walking down the street and British soldiers marching around. One of the acts, as I said, was called the Quartering Act. That said that the colonists had to provide housing for the British soldiers. Not real popular. These people are basically invading our private space here. So hopefully you get the sense that the colonists, very accustomed to basically being on their own, for 150 years, we're talking about from 1604 when the first colony, now we're talking about 1760, so over 50 years, 150 years, the colonists had been left alone. They had done their own thing. They were thriving on their own without the British being involved, other than buying all the stuff that they did, stuff they grew and manufactured, whatever. So the towns like Boston, for example, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, these towns start to become these little fortresses of British soldiers, and just the fact that the soldiers were around kind of bothered them. So that's a kind of what it looks like at that moment in time. Also at this moment in time, something that we can go back to from my first video is the fact that the Enlightenment had already taken root in the colonies. And the Enlightenment, as I already said, also talks about governance. How do we govern ourselves? Why do we govern ourselves in the way that we do, et cetera? And so a lot of the movers and shakers, guys like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Madison, these guys are students of the Enlightenment, and they're reading Enlightenment literature. Most significant, John Locke. This whole idea of government exists to protect the people's property, their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness, as we know from the Declaration of Independence. And so these ideas are popping into their heads. You need to understand, this is also going through the minds of the colonials. Now, wait a minute. Why is it that this little tiny island, 1,500 miles away across an ocean, is ruling over this massive country or this massive area that we have? Is that really what needs to happen? Should it happen? And so there develops this opposition, thinking that's going to happen. Colonial leaders starting to think about the idea that maybe British rule isn't the best for us. Okay. Because of the fact that the British were not allowing us to send representatives to Parliament to argue about these taxes and these laws that they're passing, they were saying, hey, listen, we are English citizens. We have the right to representation, just like the English people in England. And so we demand that we have representation so that we can argue about why we don't want a tax, for example, or why we don't want soldiers quartered in our homes. So this becomes a kind of battle cry for the American Revolution, as I'm sure you know. No taxation without representation. The answer that the British gave was that you have virtual representation. In other words, because you are an English citizen, Parliament automatically represents you as an English citizen. So kind of a virtual representation. But what the people in the colonies wanted was an actual representation. We want to send some persons, whatever, to Parliament to argue our case. And we begin to create these groups around the different colonies, these resistance groups, if you will, that are trying to change the rules that the British government had passed. So we've got people like the Sons of Liberty, for example. The Sons of Liberty will become the spark of the American Revolution, really, because they're the ones who will dress up as Indians and get on the rowboats and go out to the Boston Harbor in what we call the Boston Tea Party. And that Boston Tea Party is really the spark of the American Revolution. We'll talk about that in just a second. A lot of people are now starting to protest. They're starting to boycott. For example, you put a tax on tea. Okay, screw you. We're not going to buy tea. We'll buy coffee instead. And so the population changes its drinking habits from tea to coffee because of the Tea Act. And so we're talking about very, very effective ways of protest, because obviously whole companies like the East Indies Tea Company, I mean, they're going to go broke because people aren't buying their tea. All right, so let's move ahead here. What else do we got? We've got all kinds of activities happening in Boston. when a bunch of people started arguing with the army in the Boston Commons, they started throwing snowballs at them, and somehow the order to fire upon them came about, and there were people shot and killed in the Boston Commons. That, of course, is called the Boston Massacre. This is going to, again, be one of those sparks that's going to say, wait, these British are killing their own people. Okay. One can make a connection. Maybe this is a good time for me to give you what I consider to be a connection that I'm looking for in your essays. One can make the connection of what's happening today. You know, you've got the Black Lives Matter groups out there protesting, and soldiers opening fire on them. So it doesn't matter to me whether you believe in the movement or don't believe in the movement, but I just want you to know that it's a connection. It's something that's happening today. Okay, so the British begin the process of trying to appease the colonists. They start to rescind some of these acts, but the smell of blood is in the nostrils of the colonists. They begin to see the value of them being independent. They also begin a very important aspect of coming together. We seem to think that, okay, yeah, American Revolution breaks out, these 13 colonies that have always been, you know, the 13 colonies that come together. No, 13 colonies were highly individualistic. They a lot of times fought with one another over things like what border, you know, the border lines and things like that. So the colonies working with one another is something new at this time. You need to understand that, and they create what's called the Committee of Correspondence, which allows all of the colonies to tell each other what exactly is going on in their particular colony. So, as I said, 1773, the Boston Tea Party. We get the Boston Tea Party, and that's going to be the spark, because what these guys do is they throw tea into the harbor, and lest you think that this is, you know, what's the big deal? Estimated over $1 million worth of tea in today's money. We're talking about a lot of money that was thrown into the bay. And so, as the PowerPoint suggests, the empire strikes back. They create what are called the coercive acts. We call them the intolerable acts that are passed. This coercive act contained 3 pieces to it that are terrible for Massachusetts in general. They closed down the Boston port until they repay the losses of the tea. Now, how are they going to do that? Basically, the Boston harbor is where they make all of their money. So they close that down. They close down the parliament, or not the parliaments, the local governments, the colonial governments. They shut them right down, and they put in British governors to rule over the colony, where they had been ruling over themselves. And then thirdly, any crimes that were committed, they closed down the court system, the colonial court system, so that any crime that was committed, they would have to go to what was called the Court of Admiralty, which was the British military taking care of the trials. And if you were found guilty, you could be sent back to England to serve out your prison sentence. So this coercive act is horrendous for not only Massachusetts, but all the colonies now understand that if it can happen to Boston, it could happen to New York, it could happen to Philadelphia, it could happen to Norfolk, it can happen to Charleston. What gives the British the right to close down and basically destroy an economy, the economy of the colony, not to mention take away all of their liberties and their self-governance? This is a big, big deal. Once that happens, the colonists now believe that there is a conspiracy afloat where the British are now going to put us under their thumb, that they're going to basically reduce us to, basically this slavery position. Take away all of our liberties, control all of our economy. This is not good. One more thing that happens that is particularly aggravating for the Protestant 13 colonies is the Quebec Act of 1774, where the British say that those French people, the people who were originally French up in Canada, could move down into the Ohio River Valley. So now the British are allowing these Catholic French ex-enemies in Canada to come down and go into the land that they wanted to inhabit. This really aggravates them as well. And so what do? They call together what is called the First Continental Congress. Basically speaking, each of the colonies send a representative to Philadelphia, and they sit down and decide, what is it we're going to do? How are we collectively going to respond to what the British are doing to us? The First Continental Congress doesn't really do a lot. They simply say, listen, we've been looking at these Enlightenment philosophers, and we believe that we have natural rights and that they can't take away our natural rights. And it was kind of a lukewarm, let's talk to the British and see if we could straighten this whole thing out. They did do come up with a boycott for all 13 colonies. We're going to cease trade with Britain until they decide to repeal the Coercive Act. And most importantly, I think, is they said, go home and tell your colonies to start arming your colonial militia. In other words, prepare for war. Now, the reason why this is important is because the First Continental Congress puts together a committee to go across the Atlantic Ocean and to talk to King George III and to try to iron out whatever issues they might have. When they get there, King George III is in no mood to talk to them, and he wouldn't even see them. And when they were saying, oh, we want to be peaceful, blah, 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 the king says, oh, yeah, really? Well, then tell me why you're arming your colonial militias. Obviously, you're out for war. And so these men come back and say, hey, look, King George won't do anything about this. He won't listen to us. He still won't give us representation. What do we do now? And so the First Continental Congress turns into the Second Continental Congress, where the Second Continental Congress basically says, what are we going to do? How do we solve this problem? And they basically come up with the idea that the only solution is to declare our independence from Great Britain. And that of course happens in 1776. The committee was formed to write the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and I believe a guy by the name of Dickinson. But Thomas Jefferson basically writes it using the theories of the Enlightenment, which we will talk about later on. However, just so you know, the war had really begun before that, because the first shot heard around the world, Battle of Lexington and Concord, goes back to 1773. So, I mean, basically speaking, we had already begun the process of fighting the British. Okay, so let's see. I want to go to chapter 7 real quick here, or chapter 5. And I think we'll end it there. Okay, so the Second Continental Congress decides that we're going to declare independence from the British, and the American Revolution begins. Of course, we win the American Revolution. We're not going to talk much at all about the American Revolution. We're not going to talk about battles and things like that. We don't have the time to do that. Of course, we win the American Revolution, and for the first time in, well, I don't want to say if it's the first time in human history, one of those rare times in human history where people have an opportunity to create any kind of government. We just threw out the government that we didn't like. What do we do now? What do we create? And this is going to open up the possibilities of creating a government that is much different than what has existed in humanity before that. So that's going to be in Unit 2. We'll talk about creating the government we have and how it operates, it's things of that nature. So I'm hoping that will help you to answer question 3 on your unit test, and hopefully it gives you a kind of general sense of what happened in colonial America. As always, if you have any questions, problems, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to deal with you individually, try to help you as much as I possibly can. If I don't hear from you, I'm presuming that you are doing well all on your own, and you don't need my help. So that's it for this review, and hopefully I'll put another review on here for the next unit. So have a good day.